The Thanksgiving dinner table was warm, the air thick with the scent of turkey and pumpkin pie, but all Caroline could hear was the ringing in her ears as her mother, with a bright smile, casually said, "Sister's wedding was great. When's yours?" The question cut through her like a knife, its edge sharper than the polite words would ever suggest. She'd been engaged once a long time ago, but that had ended in heartbreak. Her heartbreak, not the kind that could be wrapped in a neat, pitying bow. It had been his choice to call it off, just weeks before the wedding. He'd left for reasons that were never entirely clear to Caroline, though she'd always suspected it had to do with her inability to fit the mold of the perfect bride. Her mother's words, innocent as they seemed, triggered something deep within her, a quiet, simmering resentment that had never quite gone away. "Had mine," Caroline replied, her voice colder than she intended. But that was just the surface. What her mother didn't know was that Caroline had been planning her own form of retribution for years. It started small. A few missed family gatherings, passive-aggressive comments slipped into casual conversations, even small, well-timed truths about family secrets that subtly shifted the dynamics. But it was the day her mother casually dropped that question, "When's yours?" that the real plan began to take shape. Caroline's gaze flickered to her sister, seated across the table, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling beneath the surface. Her sister, the golden child, the one whose life always seemed to go according to plan, engaged, married, now pregnant with her first child, was the final piece of Caroline's revenge. There was something so perfect about her life that it made Caroline's failures seem all the more glaring, her struggles more painful. She had once admired her sister's success, but now she envied it with a bitterness that clung to her every thought. Caroline had never been the type to act impulsively, but this time was different. The idea had bloomed inside her mind in a way that was almost elegant, a slow, creeping unraveling. She would take everything her sister had worked so hard for and twist it, carefully and precisely, until her sister's own life would reflect the shattered pieces of her own. It wouldn't be messy or violent. It wouldn't be loud. No, it would be calculated, like a slow poison, creeping through the cracks of the family's perfect facade. Caroline's hand, which had been resting on her lap, tightened into a fist. She could already see it, her sister's life disintegrating in front of her, piece by piece. All the while, her mother would wonder why Caroline had always been the quiet one, the one who never quite fit in. Caroline smiled faintly, a cold, almost imperceptible curl of her lips that no one but herself would notice. She would get everything she deserved. Caroline's plan did not begin with grand gestures but with the smallest shifts, the kind that no one notices until they're already buried too deep to claw their way out. And in the weeks after Thanksgiving she moved through her family's orbit with an unsettling calm, visiting her sister under the guise of sisterly affection while quietly studying the cracks she could widen. Her sister's new marriage, though wrapped in the sheen of honeymoon bliss, already contained the subtle fractures Caroline needed: a husband who worked too late, a mother-in-law who hovered too close, and a sister who wore her perfection like a too-tight dress that made it hard to breathe. Caroline never had to invent the chaos, only redirect what already existed, so she began with whispers disguised as concern, gentle questions about her sister's husband working late with someone from the office, asking only after watching her sister's smile tremble for half a second, planting seeds not with lies but with possibilities, the kind that grow vines around the mind and squeeze slowly. She'd strategically drop by their home with little gifts, a candle here, a dessert there, always arriving moments after an argument or moments before one would inevitably start, because she had learned their rhythms like a song. When her brother-in-law was stressed, when her sister felt insecure, when the cracks were thin enough for a whisper to slip through, Caroline never pushed too hard, only nudged, and soon her sister's once sparkling home felt dimmer, quieter, charged with the subtle tension of people who had forgotten how to speak without suspicion. Even then Caroline's revenge was not fueled by rage but by a chilling sense of purpose, as if sculpting the destruction of her sister's perfect life was the only thing that made her feel alive again after years of feeling invisible. And yet she wore her new satisfaction like a hidden jewel, smiling politely at family dinners, offering help to her pregnant sister, even driving her to doctor's appointments where she'd listen to her sister confide her fears about her marriage, about motherhood, about not being enough, and Caroline would soothe her, nodding with sympathetic eyes while feeling a dark thrill coil inside her chest. But the real turning point arrived one icy January evening when her sister called, her voice trembling, saying she'd found a message on her husband's phone that wasn't inappropriate exactly, but warm, familiar too. Familiar, and though Caroline knew exactly what it meant, because she had orchestrated the entire exchange through an old college friend who owed her a favor, she offered the perfect response. Calm, measured, supportive, telling her sister not to jump to conclusions while subtly adding, "But trust your instincts," which was all it took for her sister's unraveling to begin. Still Caroline moved cautiously, aware that revenge worked best when it appeared to have a life of its own. So she kept her distance just enough for her sister to lean in closer, confide more, rely more heavily on the only person who looked steady. And that person was Caroline, who had built her entire identity around not being the one chosen, yet now enjoyed being the one depended upon. Meanwhile, her mother remained blissfully unaware, continuing to praise Caroline's sister, to coo over sonograms and baby names, never noticing the way Caroline's eyes hardened a little each time. And though her mother's favoritism no longer stung the way it once had, it fueled Caroline's resolve like oxygen. She wanted them all to see the truth one day. Not that Caroline was broken, but that her sister had never deserved the pedestal they'd placed her on. And as winter turned to early spring, the fractures in her sister's marriage deepened into chasms, arguments erupting over nothing, tears slipping easily. The baby name list abandoned on the kitchen counter like a dream someone had stepped on. Caroline watched it all unfold with clinical precision, but beneath her cold composure something unexpected began to stir. A faint echo of guilt, not strong enough to stop her but enough to make her wonder what she would feel when the collapse was complete, and whether destroying her sister's life would finally quiet the aching emptiness in her own. Yet even that doubt became a tool, sharpening her focus, because she told herself she wasn't destroying anything. She was simply revealing what was always there, stripping away illusions, helping fate along. And so, one evening, standing at her apartment window as the city lights blinked like watchful eyes, Caroline allowed herself a thin smile as she realized part 2 of her plan was already in motion. Her sister's marriage was crumbling. Her mother would soon be forced to see the imperfections in the daughter she adored, and all Caroline needed to do now was push, gently, invisibly, and the life her sister had so effortlessly built would tip into the abyss, leaving Caroline not victorious exactly but finally seen. Spring arrived with soft rains and pale sunlight, but for Caroline's sister the world had turned gray, and Caroline, watching from the periphery like a conductor guiding a silent symphony of collapse, could feel the tension tighten toward its inevitable breaking point. Her sister's once buoyant voice now carried a tremor even in ordinary greetings, and the cheerful home that used to smell of cinnamon candles now held the stale heaviness of sleepless nights, arguments half-whispered behind closed doors and the faint metallic scent of dread. And Caroline, despite the mask of concern she wore flawlessly, tracked each shift with a meticulousness that bordered on artistry, though she told herself it was merely observation, not manipulation, merely support, not sabotage. She maintained her gentle presence with perfect timing, calling after every argument she predicted, visiting with groceries on days she knew her sister had skipped meals, and always offering soft, steady words that seemed harmless on the surface but unsettled her sister just enough to deepen her doubts, tiny verbal threads that subtly tied her to Caroline and loosened her from her husband. Even the unborn baby, once a source of glowing joy, had become a symbol of uncertainty, a shadow her sister couldn't quite articulate. And one evening when they sat together in the dim light of the living room, her sister confessed she didn't feel ready, that she sometimes wondered if she'd be doing this alone. And though Caroline felt a brief flicker of old affection, an echo of childhood sleepovers, whispered secrets, pinky promises, she buried it quickly under the cold satisfaction of progress, offering reassurance that sounded compassionate but carried the faintest implication that perhaps being alone wouldn't be the worst fate. Still, Caroline's revenge was going too smoothly, almost unnervingly so, and cracks began forming where she hadn't expected them. Her mother, once oblivious, started noticing the tension at family gatherings, asking gentle questions that made Caroline's stomach tighten. Questions like, "Have you talked to your sister?" Or "Do you think she's okay?" And Caroline responded with practiced innocence, but a ripple of unease passed through her as she realized her mother, for the first time, looked to her not with dismissive indifference but with something like trust, A recognition that made Caroline feel seen in a way she hadn't anticipated, and certainly not desired, yet. Even that was only a minor complication compared to the day her brother-in-law reached out to her privately. Not accusing, not defensive, but exhausted, pleading, confessing he didn't know how to fix things and asking if she, of all people, could help him understand what was happening to his wife. And his vulnerability struck Caroline like an unexpected blow, because it wasn't part of the script she had written. And for a moment she felt something dangerously close to guilt, a tightening in her throat as she imagined the baby they were expecting, the home they were trying to build, and how she had woven herself like a shadow into every tender space between them. But she couldn't afford hesitation now, not when the final fracture was so close, so instead she deflected with quiet sympathy, guiding him toward doubt rather than clarity, suggesting maybe her sister was struggling with more than she let on, that she needed emotional consistency, a phrase vague enough to implicate him. While sounding benign, and though he thanked her, his eyes carried a confusion that lingered with her long after he left, a question he didn't voice but that she felt pressing against her ribs. Why are you doing this? A question she refused to ask herself. Still, the tipping point came not from him but from her sister, on a stormy night when the thunder rattled the windows and Caroline arrived to find her sister sitting on the kitchen floor, swollen feet cold against the tiles, face streaked with tears, holding her husband's open laptop on her lap as if it were a weapon she didn't know how to use, and when she turned the screen toward Caroline, it revealed nothing explosive, nothing scandalous. Just a string of warm messages with a co-worker Caroline had enlisted, flirtatious in tone but vague enough to be interpreted a dozen ways. But to her sister, already fragile, it was a final confirmation, a blow that shattered whatever balance remained. And she crumpled into Caroline's arms, shaking, whispering, "I can't do this anymore." And in that moment, for the first time since this revenge had begun, Caroline felt the victory curdle into something sour, a sinking realization that her sister, her golden, envied, resented sister, was no villain, no rival, but simply human and heartbreakingly breakable. Yet the machine of destruction she'd built was already in motion, too far along to undo. And when her sister finally told her husband she needed space, meaning temporary separation, Caroline remained the steady presence at her side, even as she watched the man collapse inward, even as her mother's worry sharpened into suspicion. Suspicion not of Caroline's involvement but of her sister's emotional stability, creating a new fracture in the family Caroline hadn't planned on, one she could feel forming beneath her feet like a fault line. And as the days passed and her sister moved into the guest room of their childhood home, fragile and exhausted, Caroline visited. With the same soft-spoken compassion, but now each word felt heavier, each gesture tinged with an awareness she couldn't fully suppress, because she wasn't sure anymore whether she was offering comfort or burying her sister deeper in the ruins she'd made. Yet Caroline held her composure, telling herself it was too late for regret, too late to stop, because the collapse had begun, the pedestal was falling, and all that remained was to see what rose from the pieces, or whether anyone would recognize the hand that struck the first blow. By early summer, when the air grew heavy and the cicadas droned tirelessly in the trees, Caroline sensed a shift she hadn't planned for, a heaviness in the atmosphere around her sister, not just the melancholy of a failing marriage, but a dangerous stillness, like the breath held before a scream. Her sister had moved back into their childhood home with the quiet resignation of someone who believed they'd already failed, drifting through the familiar rooms like a reluctant ghost, and Caroline found herself visiting more often, not to tighten her trap, not to manipulate the cracks she'd created, but because something in her sister's silence unsettled her, a new kind of fragility that didn't fit neatly into the architecture of revenge she had constructed. Their mother fussed endlessly, clinging to hope that the separation was temporary, but those hopes wilted in the heat like flowers left in direct sun, especially when her sister began avoiding phone calls from her husband and ignoring the gentle texts he still sent every morning, texts she now read without expression before locking her phone away in a drawer, as if its screen contained something that threatened to unmake her. And though Caroline told herself she should feel triumphant, this was, after all, the collapse she had orchestrated. What she felt instead was a creeping sense of unease that curled inside her like smoke, especially on days her sister seemed too quiet, too withdrawn, staring out windows as though expecting the world to deliver an answer it never did. Caroline had always pictured revenge as a sharp, satisfying thing, something that patched old wounds with the satisfaction of justice, but what she saw now was different. The unraveling wasn't clean or cinematic, it was slow and human, leaving shrapnel she hadn't accounted for, and when her sister's doctor cautioned her about stress, saying it was affecting the pregnancy, Caroline felt a cold jolt travel up her spine. Not guilt exactly, but a fear she hadn't expected, a fear of what might happen if the dominoes she'd set in motion fell too far. Yet even that fear didn't stop things from progressing, because the world she'd destabilized had begun to collapse under its own weight, and her sister's husband, who had been patient and pleading for months, finally reached a breaking point of his own. He showed up at the family home one humid evening, face pale and hands shaking, asking to speak with her sister, insisting they had to talk. Before the baby came, before the distance hardened into something permanent, but her sister, curled on the couch with a blanket despite the heat, refused to see him, whispering to Caroline, "I can't, not now," in a voice so brittle it barely carried, and Caroline, standing between them, felt the surreal realization that she was no longer merely nudging events but mediating a disaster, one she had crafted but now struggled to control. Her mother, frazzled and overwhelmed, demanded answers neither sister would give, and Caroline felt that familiar tightening in her chest as her mother's eyes landed on her with expectation, as though she held the missing explanation, the key to solving a puzzle everyone sensed but no one understood. For a moment Caroline almost told the truth. Not the whole truth, but enough. That her sister was exhausted, vulnerable, terrified. But the words stuck to her tongue like thorns, because admitting even that felt like confessing her own hand in the tree that had grown from the seed she planted. Still, the night spiraled, emotions fraying like loose threads, until her sister retreated to her room and her husband left in despair, promising he would try again tomorrow. His voice cracking in a way that made Caroline's pulse stumble, because his grief, unlike the distant imaginary villain she'd pictured, was painfully real. And in the quiet after he left, Caroline sat with her mother at the kitchen table. The two of them bathed in the yellow glow of the overhead light, neither speaking until her mother said softly, so softly it nearly slipped past Caroline's defenses, "I don't know what's happening, but I'm scared for her." And something in those words pierced Caroline in a place she had fortified long ago, breaking through the armor she'd built from years of resentment and loneliness, because it was the first time her mother had admitted fear instead of control, vulnerability instead of judgment. And Caroline suddenly felt the weight of what she'd done pressing against her ribs like a held breath threatening to burst. But she didn't confess, didn't crumble. She simply nodded, playing the role of the steady daughter, the reliable one, all while the truth gnawed at her with increasing sharpness. And over the next week, as summer storms rolled through in heavy sheets, her sister's emotional state worsened, her exhaustion deepening into something that no longer looked like grief but resignation, a quiet surrender that frightened Caroline more than anger or tears ever had, because it felt like her sister was beginning to let go, not just of the marriage, but of herself, of everything, even the baby growing inside her. And when Caroline came by one late afternoon to find her sister sitting in the nursery that had been painted weeks before the separation, gently rocking in a chair with empty eyes, it struck her with a clarity that nearly brought her to her knees. She hadn't just dismantled her sister's marriage, she had dismantled the person inside it. And for the first time since she'd set her revenge in motion, Caroline felt a tremor run through her. A recognition that the collapse she wanted so desperately had grown into something monstrous, something she no longer controlled, because what she saw in her sister's hollow, distant gaze was not the fall of a pedestal but the quiet, terrifying possibility that her sister might break entirely. And as she knelt beside the rocking chair, placing a gentle hand on her sister's knee, Caroline realized that the next move, the final move, would come not from calculated strategy but from something she had not felt in years. Fear, raw and unfiltered, not of losing revenge, but of losing her sister altogether. The night everything tipped began without warning. No storm, no raised voices, just a stillness so unnatural it prickled at Caroline's skin the moment she stepped inside the house. Her mother was in the kitchen scrubbing a single plate with frantic repetition, as if cleaning could ward off everything unraveling around them, and when she looked up at Caroline her eyes were red, her voice tight as she whispered, "She's in the nursery again." And Caroline felt that now familiar flicker of dread ignite in her chest, sharper than guilt, more jagged than regret. She walked down the hallway, each step quieter than the last, and when she reached the nursery door she found it cracked open, a thin beam of lamplight spilling into the hall. Inside, her sister sat in the rocking chair again, not moving this time, one hand resting on her belly as though holding on to something slipping away, the other hand dangling at her side, fingers trembling. Caroline entered without speaking, lowering herself to the floor beside the chair, but her sister didn't look at her. She stared straight ahead, eyes reflecting the mobile above the crib, little wooden stars spinning slowly in the draft from the vent. "Caroline," she whispered finally, her voice flat, scraped raw. "I don't think I'm supposed to be someone's mother." The words sank into the room like stones, heavy and final. For a moment Caroline couldn't breathe. This wasn't uncertainty. This wasn't fear. This was surrender, the kind that comes at the very edge of someone's strength. And suddenly, all the careful lines she'd drawn, all the subtle manipulations she'd crafted with precision, shattered in an instant. Her sister wasn't breaking because of a marriage or a man. She was breaking because the ground beneath her had been quietly eroded until there was nothing left to stand on. Eroded by Caroline. A nausea rolled through her, hot and sharp as she whispered, "You're overwhelmed. That's normal." Her sister only shook her head, slow and defeated. "I don't recognize myself anymore." Her breathing hitched. "I keep thinking, maybe everyone would be better off." The sentence fractured before she finished it, but the meaning struck Caroline like a slap. She reached for her sister's hand instinctively, fingers wrapping tightly around hers, and for the first time in years there was no strategy, no calculation. Just fear, raw and unfiltered, fear that she had pushed too far, that she had broken something she could never repair. "Stop," Caroline said, her voice trembling. "Don't say that. Don't even think that." Her sister let out a soft, miserable laugh. "I can't sleep. Can't eat. I can't breathe without wondering what I ruined." She finally looked at Caroline, and it was worse than tears. It was emptiness, a hollow absence where her sister's fire used to be. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be enough." The baby kicked then, a small flutter beneath her sister's hand, and something inside Caroline cracked like thin glass. That tiny movement, the proof of life, of innocence, made her suddenly aware of the enormity of what she had shaped. She hadn't just fractured a marriage. She had destabilized a future. Family. A child who didn't ask to be born into chaos. The walls of the nursery felt too close, too tight, and Caroline felt her breath catching as if she were the one drowning. She tried to speak but her throat closed, and that's when her sister, in her fragile, unraveling state, whispered, "I think I'm losing the baby." A cold shock ripped through Caroline. What? When did that start? Her sister pressed a hand to her stomach, wincing. "All day. Cramping. Pressure." "I didn't want to scare Mom." Caroline bolted to her feet. "We're going to the hospital. Now." She grabbed her sister's arm, steadying her as she stood, and her sister leaned into her with a weakness that terrified her. Caroline shouted for their mother, who rushed down the hallway in a panic, and together they half-carried, half-guided her sister to the car. As they drove through the night, past streetlights that flickered like warning signals, Caroline stared ahead with a rigid focus, her knuckles white around the steering wheel. Every manipulation she'd made, every seed planted, every whisper offered, echoed back at her like a chorus of accusations. She had wanted her sister to fall. She had not considered what would shatter with her. In the hospital's sterile light, while nurses rushed her sister into an exam room, Caroline sank into a plastic waiting chair and buried her face in her hands, her breath trembling. For the first time, she allowed the truth to surface, unfiltered and merciless. She had done this. She had taken pain she couldn't bear and twisted it outward. She had turned her sister into a canvas for revenge she thought she deserved. Her mother sat beside her, holding her shaking hand, and whispered, "Please tell me she's going to be okay." Caroline didn't answer. She couldn't. The weight of her own silence felt like a confession, even if no one else understood it. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, a doctor approached. His expression difficult to read. "She's stable," he said carefully. "The baby is okay for now. But the stress she's under is significant. She needs rest, support, stability. Stability. The one thing Caroline had stolen. Her mother burst into relieved tears, but Caroline felt only a crushing heaviness, a truth too large to hide from anymore. She excused herself, slipping quietly into the dimly lit corridor outside her sister's room. Through the window, she could see her sister asleep, pale but breathing, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. A fragile peace, but a peace nonetheless. And that was when something inside Caroline broke, not in the volatile, destructive way she once imagined, but in a quiet, aching way, like a mirror finally cracking under the strain of a reflection it can no longer hold. She touched the glass lightly, whispering to no one, "I didn't want this." But the truth answered anyway, cold and undeniable. "You did." And now the question hanging in the hospital's still air wasn't how to finish her revenge. It was whether she could stop the damage before the next fracture destroyed everything, including the sister she never meant to lose. The plan was no longer in her hands. And neither was the ending.